Yes, infant mortality was that high. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around it now. We live in a world where a baby's death is a shocking tragedy. It's an aberration, something that goes against the natural order of things. But for almost all of human history, it was the opposite. A baby's survival was the miracle. Its death was a sad but expected part of life. Let's try to put some numbers to this, even though historical records can be fuzzy. In the Roman Empire, it's estimated that about 30% of all infants died before their first birthday. 1 in 3. Imagine a street with 10 houses. In 3 of those homes, a baby born this year will not see its first birthday. And that's just the first year. Many more would die before reaching the age of 5. Maybe half of all children born never made it to adulthood. It didn't get much better for a long, long time. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the numbers stayed stubbornly high. In some European cities in the 17th and 18th centuries, the infant mortality rate was sometimes even higher, especially in poor, crowded areas. We're talking 200, 300, or even 400 deaths per 1,000 live births. Today, in a country like the United States or Japan, that number is around 5 or 2. The difference is staggering. It's not just a little bit worse, it's a completely different reality. Think about what that means for a family. A woman might give birth to 8 children in her lifetime. She would consider herself lucky if 4 of them survived to grow up. She would name a baby, love it, care for it, and live with the constant, nagging fear that it could be taken from her at any moment by a fever, a cough, or a bout of diarrhea. This wasn't a rare event. It was the background noise of life. You can see it in old letters and diaries. People wrote about the death of a child with a kind of resigned sadness. There was grief, of course, deep and painful grief. But there was also an acceptance that this was God's will, or simply the way of the world. It was so common that some cultures didn't even officially name a baby until it had survived for a few weeks or months. It was a way of emotionally protecting oneself from the inevitable pain. Even into the 19th century, in places like London, Paris, and New York, the situation was grim. The Industrial Revolution brought millions of people into cities that weren't equipped to handle them. They lived in crowded tenements with no running water and no sanitation. Waste was thrown into the streets. The water people drank was often contaminated with sewage. For a tiny, vulnerable infant, this environment was a death trap. Diseases we barely worry about today, like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid, swept through neighborhoods and killed babies by the thousands. In the year 1900, in the United States, the infant mortality rate was still around 100 per 1,000 live births. That means 1 in every 10 babies died. This wasn't in some far-off medieval kingdom. This was in the age of the telephone and the automobile. Your own great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents lived in this world. They likely knew the pain of losing a baby, or had siblings who never got the chance to grow up. The change, when it finally came, was rapid and dramatic. But for the vast overwhelming majority of human existence, the answer to the question is a clear and heartbreaking yes. The loss of infant life was on a scale we can barely comprehend. It shaped families, societies, and the entire human experience in ways we are only just beginning to appreciate from our modern, safer world. It wasn't just a statistic. It was a constant, personal, and devastating reality. So why did so many babies die? It wasn't one single thing. It was a whole host of dangers, an assault on a fragile new life from every direction. But many of these killers were obvious, even if people at the time didn't fully understand them. They were the visible immediate causes of death, infection, starvation, and dehydration. Infection was the great monster. Before people understood that tiny, invisible germs caused disease, the world was a very dirty place. And babies, with their brand new untrained immune systems, were the most vulnerable victims. The danger started at birth. The process of being born is messy. In the past, it was often done in unhygienic conditions, with unwashed hands and unsterilized tools. A tiny cut or scrape on the baby could become a gateway for deadly bacteria. Tetanus of the newborn, caused by bacteria entering the umbilical cord stump, was a common and horrific way to die. The baby would suffer muscle spasms, lockjaw, and eventually be unable to breathe. Then there was childbed fever, or puerperal fever. This was an infection of the mother after childbirth, but it showed just how rampant bacteria were. Doctors would go from performing an autopsy on a dead body to delivering a baby without washing their hands. They were unknowingly carrying death from one person to another. If the environment was that deadly for a full-grown woman, imagine it for her infant. After birth, the threats continued. The water was a primary source of danger. For most of history, people got their drinking water from wells, rivers, or streams that were often contaminated with human and animal waste. To an adult, a bit of contaminated water might cause some stomach upset. To a baby, it could be a death sentence. Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread through water cause severe diarrhea. And this brings us to the second great killer dehydration from diarrheal disease. We call it the runs or an upset stomach today. We drink some Gatorade and feel better in a day or two. But for an infant, losing body fluids so rapidly is catastrophic. Their tiny bodies don't have the reserves to handle it. Sure. They would become lethargic, their eyes would sink, and within a day or two, their organs would shut down. This was an incredibly common way for babies to die. Parents would watch helpless as their child simply faded away. They called it things like summer complaint or teething sickness, trying to put a name to a terrifying and mysterious process. But what was really killing their babies was contaminated water and milk, which leads to the third major killer: malnutrition and the problems of feeding. For a baby, the best and safest food is its mother's milk. It's nutritious, and it passes on some of the mother's immunities. But what if the mother died in childbirth? What if she was too sick or malnourished herself to produce enough milk? What if she had to work long hours in a field or a factory and couldn't be with her baby to breastfeed? These were common problems. The solutions were all poor substitutes. One option was a wet nurse, another woman who would breastfeed the baby. But this was expensive, and the wet nurse's own health was a factor. A more common solution was animal milk, usually from a cow or a goat. But this came with its own set of problems. First, without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly. It could be teeming with bacteria before it even reached the baby's lips. Second, animal milk doesn't have the same nutritional composition as human milk. It's harder for a baby to digest. People tried to make it work. They would use crude feeding bottles made of pottery or pewter, which were impossible to clean properly and became breeding grounds for germs. Or they would make something called pap, a mixture of bread or flour boiled with water or milk. It was a starchy, low-nutrient slurry. That was a poor substitute for the real thing. A baby fed on these things was often undernourished, making it even more susceptible to the infections that were all around it. It was a vicious cycle. A poorly fed baby gets sick more easily, and a sick baby doesn't want to eat, making it even weaker. The line between malnutrition and infection was often blurred. They worked together, a deadly partnership that claimed millions of young lives. The immediate causes of death, infection, and malnutrition were only part of the story. To really understand why so many babies died, you have to look at the world they were born into. It was a world without our modern understanding of medicine, a world of deep poverty for most, and a world where the very act of living was more dangerous. Let's start with the birth itself. Today, childbirth is a medical event that usually takes place in a sterile hospital with trained professionals ready to handle complications. For most of history, it was a terrifying ordeal that took place at home, managed by family members or a local midwife. These midwives often had practical experience, but they had no knowledge of germs or anatomy. If the baby was in the wrong position, if the labor went on for too long, or if there were other complications, there was very little they could do. Birth injuries were common, both for the mother and the baby. A prolonged, difficult birth could leave a baby brain damaged or physically injured, drastically reducing its chances of survival. The use of forceps, when they were invented, was a brutal and often deadly procedure in untrained hands. Then there was the simple reality of poverty. Most people in history were poor. They lived in small, crowded, drafty homes. In the winter, families might huddle together in one room to stay warm, breathing the same air. If one person got a respiratory illness, like influenza, pneumonia, or whooping cough, it would spread through the house like wildfire. Whooping cough was especially deadly for infants. The violent coughing spells could prevent them from breathing, and they would suffocate. Tuberculosis was another common killer that thrived in these crowded, poorly ventilated conditions. A baby's developing lungs stood little chance. The lack of basic sanitation was a constant threat. Without indoor plumbing, people used outhouses or chamber pots. Waste was often thrown into the street or a nearby ditch. This created a perfect breeding ground for flies and other pests, which would then contaminate food and surfaces inside the home. A baby crawling on the floor could easily pick up germs that would lead to a fatal illness. The very air and ground were saturated with disease in a way we can't imagine. Beyond the physical environment, there was the problem of medical knowledge, or rather the lack of it. Before the late 19th century, doctors didn't know what caused disease. The prevailing theory was miasma, the idea that sickness was caused by bad smells or foul air. Other theories involved an imbalance of the four: Hummers in the body. So the treatments they offered were often useless or even harmful. If a baby had a fever, a doctor might recommend bloodletting or applying leeches to release the bad blood. They might prescribe toxic substances like mercury or arsenic in small doses. They would give harsh purgatives or emetics to cleanse the system of a baby already weak from diarrhea. These cures could easily kill a child that might have otherwise survived. Parents, desperate to save their baby, would subject them to these painful and dangerous treatments, believing they were doing the right thing. Finally, we have to acknowledge the harsh social realities of the time. Life was hard, and sometimes people had to make impossible choices. In times of famine or extreme poverty, a new baby was another mouth to feed. While most parents did everything they could, the practice of abandonment was not uncommon. A desperate mother might leave her baby on the steps of a church or an orphanage, hoping it would have a better chance at life. But these foundling homes were often overcrowded and rife with disease. The mortality rates inside them were astronomical, sometimes approaching 100%. There was also the stigma of illegitimate births. A young, unmarried woman who became pregnant faced social ruin. Lacking any support, she might feel that abandoning or even killing her newborn was her only option. This is a dark and difficult part of the story, but infanticide was a real, if hidden, contributor to the death toll. It was born of desperation in a society that offered little compassion or help. All these factors, the dangerous birth, the poor living conditions, the flawed medical ideas, and the brutal social pressures, created a world that was fundamentally hostile to new life. For thousands of years, the story was the same. Babies were born and babies died in huge numbers. It seemed like an unchangeable fact of life. But then, starting in the late 19th century and accelerating through the 20th, something incredible happened. The numbers started to drop. It wasn't one single discovery, but a series of breakthroughs that built on each other. We, as a society, started to win the war against infant mortality. The absolute, undeniable turning point was the acceptance of germ theory. The work of scientists like Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany in the 1860s and 70s proved that invisible microorganisms, bacteria, and viruses were the real cause of many diseases. This was a revolution in human thought. It wasn't bad air or an imbalance of humors. It was tiny living things that could be fought and killed. This one idea changed everything. Suddenly, hygiene made sense. The simple act of washing your hands wasn't just about being clean, it was about removing deadly germs. And doctors like Ignaz Semmelweis and Joseph Lister had already shown that antiseptic practices in hospitals could dramatically reduce deaths, but germ theory provided the scientific reason why. Hospitals started sterilizing instruments. Surgeons started washing their hands and wearing clean gowns. Midwives and doctors learned to be more careful during childbirth. This alone saved countless mothers and babies from infection at the very start of life. The second huge step was applying this new knowledge to public life. This was the birth of public health. Cities began to invest in massive infrastructure projects. They built sewer systems to carry waste safely away from homes. They built water treatment plants to provide clean, safe drinking water to their citizens. This was arguably the single most effective life-saving measure in human history. When you stop people from drinking water contaminated with cholera and typhoid, you stop the deadly diarrheal diseases that killed so many infants. It wasn't a fancy medicine or a complex surgery, it was engineering and political will. At the same time, knowledge about nutrition began to improve. Scientists discovered vitamins and learned about their role in health. People began to understand that a baby needed more than just starchy pap to thrive. This led to public education campaigns teaching mothers about the benefits of breastfeeding. For babies who couldn't be breastfed, the situation also got much better. The process of pasteurization, developed by Louis Pasteur, could be applied to milk. Heating milk killed harmful bacteria, making it much safer for infants to drink. The invention of reliable home refrigeration also meant that milk and food could be kept fresh for longer. The development of infant formula in the 20th century provided a nutritionally balanced and safe alternative when breast milk wasn't an option. Then came the age of modern medicine. The development of vaccines was a miracle. For diseases that had once been a terrifying rite of passage for children, smallpox, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, could now be prevented with a simple shot. Smallpox alone killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century, many of them children. Today, it is completely eradicated. Measles, which could lead to fatal pneumonia or encephalitis, is now rare in countries with good vaccination programs. The discovery of antibiotics in the mid-20th century was another giant leap. For the first time, doctors had a weapon that could actually kill bacteria inside the body. A child with pneumonia, strep throat, or a skin infection could be cured with a course of penicillin. Infections that were once a near-certain death sentence became treatable illnesses. Pediatrics, the medical specialty focused on children, emerged. Doctors now focus specifically on the unique needs of infants and children, developing better ways to diagnose and treat their illnesses. All these things, germ theory, public sanitation, better nutrition, vaccines, and antibiotics, worked together. A baby born into a cleaner world with better food and access to preventative medicine was much stronger and less likely to get sick in the first place. And if that baby did get sick, there were now effective treatments to help it recover. The old vicious cycle was broken. A new virtuous cycle had begun. One that led to the world we live in today, where the survival of a child is something we can and should expect. It's easy to look back at the history of infant mortality and feel a sense of triumph. And we should. The drop from 1 in 3 babies dying to less than 1 in 100 in many parts of the world is one of the greatest achievements in human history. It's a testament to science, public health, and our collective will to give our children a better life. We have successfully defeated many of the old killers, but the story isn't over. The fight continues, and it looks different depending on where you live. In wealthy, developed nations, the picture has changed completely. The old enemies, diarrheal disease from dirty water, rampant bacterial infections are largely gone. The infant mortality rate is incredibly low. When a baby does die in one of these countries today, it is usually due to a different set of causes. The biggest challenges now are related to the very beginning of life. Prematurity is a major factor. Babies born too early have underdeveloped lungs and other organs, and they are extremely fragile. While our neonatal intensive care units, or NICUs, can perform miracles, some babies are just too small and too sick to survive. Congenital abnormalities or birth defects are another leading cause. These are problems with how a baby's body forms in the womb. Some are genetic, while others have unknown causes. Advances in prenatal screening and surgery have helped, but many of these conditions remain very difficult to treat. We also still struggle with things like sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, the unexplained death of a seemingly healthy baby in its sleep. Public health campaigns like the Back to Sleep movement have dramatically reduced the number of SIDS deaths, but we still don't fully understand why it happens. So, in the developed world, the fight has moved to the frontiers of medical science, genetics, and neonatal care. But if you shift your gaze to many parts of the developing world, the picture looks tragically familiar. In some of the poorest countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, the infant mortality rates are still shockingly high. They are not as high as they were in medieval Europe, but they are many, many times higher than in wealthy countries. And the reasons are the same old ones. The killers are still infection, malnutrition, and dehydration. Millions of people still lack access to clean drinking water and basic sanitation. Babies still die from diarrheal diseases that would be easily treatable with simple oral rehydration salts. Pneumonia is still a major killer. Many births still happen at home without a skilled attendant present, leading to infections and complications that could have been prevented. Maternal health is a huge piece of the puzzle. A malnourished, anemic, or sick mother is more likely to give birth to a low-weight, vulnerable baby. And if the mother dies, the baby's chances of survival plummet. Access to basic healthcare, vaccines, antibiotics, prenatal checkups is still not a reality for everyone. The simple, relatively cheap interventions that saved millions of lives in the West a century ago are still not reaching every child who needs them. So, the massive gap between the rich and poor parts of the world is reflected in these life and death statistics. A baby's chance of seeing its first birthday depends heavily on where it is born. This global disparity is the central challenge in the fight against infant mortality today. What this history teaches us is that progress is not automatic. The safety and health our children enjoy today was not given to us. It was earned through centuries of scientific discovery, hard work, and public investment. It reminds us not to take things like clean water, vaccines, and good sanitation for granted. They are the invisible pillars that hold up our modern, healthy society, and it shows us that the work is not done. The knowledge and tools to save almost every child from the old diseases exist. The challenge now is a matter of access, equity, and political will. The question is no longer just, was infant mortality that high, but why, when we know how to prevent it, is it still so high for so many? The answer to that question will define the next chapter in this long and vital human story.